Hello, it's me again, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I talked about earlier before I showed you how to make a clay house. Now, I'm going to start this time by talking about my house, the one I live in. It's over 110 years old, and a lot has changed to our house in that time. It's had many different owners. It's had a new roof, new windows. It's had plumbing and new walls installed upstairs so they could have, in what probably was the 1950s, the luxury of an indoor bathroom. We've had walls knocked down downstairs to create a bigger living room and to knock through into that outdoor toilet that nobody wanted to use anymore to create a bigger kitchen and have doors that go into the garden. Now, we've also decorated it lots of times, so it must have been decorated numerous times over the years. But one thing that hasn't changed in all of that time is something I can't really see. Our house's foundations. Our house has stood through 2 world wars, many storms, and even some really bad Cressey DIY. Its foundations have helped it stay firm, steady, and dependable. Both of this week's readings talk about having the right foundations for our faith. In Luke 6, this is obvious. Jesus is teaching in what is known as a parable. Now, when I was young, I was told a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. The earthly story here is about how a house is built, where a house is built, and how it will cope in a storm. And it relates to our lives in a spiritual context. In verse 46, Jesus talks about the type of person he would compare a foolish builder to. Now, the foolish builder Jesus talks about is somebody who chooses to build his house on the sand. And we all know that the rain comes and the house falls flat. Now, Jesus compares this person to somebody who might look at Jesus and say, "Oh, Lord," but who wouldn't listen to Jesus, that person. And that person wouldn't really follow Jesus' instructions. In verse 47, Jesus goes on to talk about the kind of person he'd compare a wise builder to. Now, this wise builder would put more thought into how and where he built his house. The wise builder would look for somewhere that was maybe trickier but more solid to build on. His house would take longer to build. It would definitely be harder to build and probably more costly. But when the rain came and the storm blew, we all know that the house would stay still and firm, just like ours has done. Now, Jesus compares this builder to somebody who not only says Lord, but actually listens to what Jesus says and does their very best to follow Jesus' teaching. Now, the beginning of Galatians, Paul would compare himself to the wise builder. He starts in his greeting by using himself as an example to follow. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're really honest, do you do what I do and skip those opening greetings in Paul's letter? They're just saying hello to whoever he's writing to. They're never really that important, other than this one really is. Right from the very first sentence, Paul reminds the Galatian Christians that him and his missionary partners had set out to teach the gospel in Jesus' authority. His message, this gospel that he is teaching, is built on the rock or the foundation of Jesus. And Paul carries on teaching in verses 3 to 5 of chapter 1 of Galatians, giving grace and peace and reminding those Galatian Christians that Jesus rescues us from our sin by the will of God, showing the Galatians that they can be blessed by following Jesus' gospel that Paul taught them. It might be helpful here to have a think about what gospel means. It means good news. So Paul here is talking about the good news revealed by Jesus. We looked at this last week when we looked at Jesus meeting Nicodemus. And John provides maybe one of the most famous explanations for the gospel in John 3:16. He says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." And Jesus continues his teaching in verse 17, saying, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." This leads us back to Galatians chapter 1, where we pick up at verse 6. Paul compares Jesus' gospel to another gospel. This gospel does not seem to bring such good news. It is gospel that is crafted by foolish builders. This gospel has been taught by Jews who live in Galatia, who've managed to convince these new Christians that they must follow the Jewish teachings too. Now, when Paul first visited Galatia, these same Jews opposed his teaching. In Lystra, they even threw stones at Paul. These Jews were not trying to help the new believers, rather shame them into thinking that believing in Jesus was not enough in itself. By listening to and accepting the Jews' teaching, the Galatians have slipped into being foolish builders, quite possibly without any intention of harming their own faith. Paul is astonished that at the Galatian Jews, as they are deliberately steering the Galatian Christians away from Christ. God has sent Jesus into the world to forgive the world and not condemn it. The Jews were teaching the new Christians that they were condemned, not forgiven. Paul is not impressed. He is very firm on this. He goes as far as saying that those teaching gospels that are not Jesus' gospel should be cursed. The Galatian Christians have listened to Jesus' gospel, but they were following the gospel the Jews had changed, and they had become foolish builders who risked their faith being flattened on the next storm that they faced. Paul did not want the Galatians to fail like the foolish builder's house did, and that is why he wrote to them. Over the next few weeks, we'll look at some of the highlights of this letter as Paul reteaches the Galatians how to build their faith on the firm foundation that is Jesus and become wise builders again. Now, if you or someone else in your house made a clay house this week, it would be great if you could put it on display. And perhaps in a quiet moment, definitely when it is dried, you could pick it up like I'm doing now and think, when we are building our faith, what gospel are we building our faith on? Are we building our faith on Jesus' gospel? Or have we changed the gospel like the Galatian Jews did? Sometimes, like the Galatian Christians, we need to be reminded of what we think we already know. I've been a Christian for over 30 years, and a lot has changed in my life in that time. I've grown up, I've got married, I've had several different jobs, and I've become a parent. Just like my house has changed a lot. But my foundations have stayed strong because my faith has good foundations. You can't see them, they do a really good job. In my life, through many storms and several adventures, my faith has held firm and steady. It's been dependable, there to support me through good days and tough ones. Is your faith steady and strong and dependable? If it is, then we know that it's built on Jesus' teaching.